Well, it's good to be with you all, and as you can see, there are snacks up here. Don't get distracted by the snacks yet. We'll get to that point in a minute, but I'm glad that you're all here this morning. We are in the middle of a series called The Way of Change, and I've been extremely grateful. The last 3 weeks, we had some different speakers up here, Pastor Adam and Pastor Jonathan from the Norton campus. Loved hearing from them, and then Josiah came up last week and talked, and so I'm very grateful, but also I'm excited for you guys to hear from different voices in this series. In this series, we're talking about change, right? We're talking about change. And I think that change is something that we all desire, right? Something that internally kind of shakes us and moves us, and we're like, we want to change, and yet we don't always know where the starting point is. And I remember, Josiah, he was up here, and he was talking about kind of the facial hair change that he was making in his life during this series. He's grown a mustache, a little beard. It's looking pretty good at this point. I remember when I made a big change in regards to my hair. When I was growing up in middle school, I started to get into kind of the longer hair look. Kind of Justin Bieber was into this Justin Bieber hair, all that stuff. So I had hair kind of like the swooshy stuff like Justin Bieber did. That was what was in, okay? And so I grew up, I got this hair in middle school, freshman year, sophomore, I had this hair, and it was neat. It was awesome. It was the thing. And then I started playing football. And I realized that lots of hair and a helmet do not correlate very well on the football field. And so, junior year, right before my junior year started, I went to this. And it has forever been this. And we can take that picture off, Olivia, because we don't want to look at that for a very long time. Thank you. But I remember that that was a major change in my life. But this series, right? This series, we're not just talking about this external change that we make as we journey through life. We're not just talking about the external stuff that happens. We're talking about this internal transformation that takes place in our life. And we're saying this throughout this series, the way of change is following the way of Jesus. The way of change is following the way of Jesus, practicing His presence in my life. It was interesting, as we talked through the first week of this series, we said that willpower in and of itself cannot change us internally. Like, we can try hard enough, we can say certain things, we can try to do all the right things, and yet the willpower, the muster of that will never lead to change. And if you're a follower of Jesus, something interesting is a part of your life. You have the Spirit of God that resides in you, that lives inside of you, that allows for inner transformation to take place in your life. And we looked at a passage, John 15. John 15, verse 5 says this, I am the vine, this is Jesus talking, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. He's like, you can't do it on your own. You have to remain in me. And then John, later on in another book, 1 John 2, he says this, whoever says they abide in him ought to walk in the same way he walked. And we so talked about this the first week. We said change does not come by willpower, but change comes by remaining in Jesus. It's remaining to the vine. We are the branch. He is the vine. We remain in Him. And then out of that, we see transformation and fruit being born into our lives. That we're bearing fruit out of remaining in Jesus. It's fascinating, right? Because then we start to tinker around and say, what does that look like to remain in Jesus? What does that mean? Right? How do I stay connected to the vine? We said staying connected to the vine is kind of living out and putting into play these practices, these spiritual disciplines or spiritual practices in our life. And this is what we said about the practices. Really, these practices are kind of getting you onto the path of running into the presence of God, which leads to transformation. We said it's a scary thing, though, because these practices, right, good in and of themselves, they are a means to an end, not the end in of themselves. Sometimes we can make it legalistic, and they are what we have to do, and we have to stay in line over here, and we got to make sure we're doing them because that's what a good Christian does. We got to check them off the list so we can fall off that side of the cliff. Or we can come over here and say, well, isn't it by grace alone, right? We're saved. We got to get into heaven free card. Why do I have to do all these practices? It doesn't make sense. Why don't I just live my life? We said, no. These practices that Jesus built into the rhythm of His life are there to lead us into His presence, into transformation. We looked at a couple of these things. Community. We looked at simplicity. We looked at generosity, right? And last week, Josiah did a great job at fleshing out feasting, which we're going to look at fasting today, okay? We looked at feasting, and here's my hope. Here's my hope. If you are someone that says you've said yes to Jesus, you're a follower of Christ, right? I hope this is encouraging to you, this series. I hope it's something that encourages you and allows you to kind of put into play these practices into the rhythm of your life and equips you in that way. That is my hope out of this series. If you're someone that's never said yes to Jesus before, you're just kind of exploring this Christianity thing out, you're exploring God, you're like, I'm not really in that boat. I hope that today and throughout this series, you get a peek into what the Christian life is all about, what it means to follow Jesus, what it looks like to say yes to Jesus ultimately. That is my desire. Like I said last week, we talked about feasting, which is a really fun topic. Josiah did an amazing job. I loved him fleshing that out and talking about feasting. It encouraged me deeply. So today we're going to talk about fasting. Yes, fasting, right? I get the symmetrical piece of that. And I told him, I said, you get all the fun ones. So next time I'm going to give you one that's not as much fun, and we're going to have a good time. But fasting, here's what I want you to write down. Fasting is the assumption. Today we're going to kind of run into this assumption that's based on our consumption. Okay? Fasting. And I think we have an assumption that is based on our consumption. Okay? A lot of times we sit over here at this table. Okay? You see all the snacks and you're all jealous. And I even have a donut up here, right? I brought it back, right? Not the same one, but I brought another one back, right? Oftentimes we'll sit over here and we live in a consumeristic culture. We live in a consumption culture where it says that if you want, you can have. Get all that you need, right? We live in this culture that just kind of provides, fill up the holes in your life by consuming. We see that throughout multiple wavelengths of our culture, but I think we see that in food. There's some interesting statistics about us, and I think we kind of have this assumption about fasting, and it's kind of an anomaly in our culture, in our Western culture, to see or hear people fasting, because we live in a culture that is not in like need of food, right? We have the accessibility, we have the amounts of food that is never ending, right? You go to the grocery store, you have food on top of food. We're told that you have to have 3 meals a day. That is what the diet should be, and then you snack in between. And then if you're Taco Bell, you have the 4th meal, right? You have the 4th meal at midnight, right? You just get fed all this stuff and consume. We see it in our food. We see it in the culture of restaurants and fast food. It's interesting, McDonald's. I don't know how many McDonald's fans. My dad was not a McDonald's fan, so I did not experience Mickey D's growing up as much as others, but it was interesting. I was looking up statistics in this. In Ohio, there's roughly 11 million people that live in Ohio, okay? So roughly 11 million, a little bit over that. The amount of McDonald's in Ohio is 823, which means that there are 7.1 McDonald's per 100,000 people in Ohio, which makes us number 1 in the nation on the McDonald's to people ratio, right? That's the consumption that we have, that McDonald's are found everywhere. You can turn the corner, you'll see a McDonald's somewhere. But I went even further. I'm just going to keep looking because I'm in it, right? I'm in it. So the top 20 fast food restaurants in our nation includes like Wendy's and Burger King and Arby's and McDonald's. If you take the top 20 fast food restaurants and you look at all the individual locations of those restaurants across America, there are over 50,000 individual locations of those fast food restaurants across our nation. They're absolutely everywhere. But let's take it to another level, because a couple weeks ago we had Super Bowl Sunday, or a few weeks ago we had Super Bowl Sunday, right? And you look at the amount of food that we intake on a Super Bowl Sunday, it is absolutely incredible. This is just to America. 1.25 billion wings are consumed just on Super Bowl Sunday, which makes me sick. It's kind of cool, but it makes me sick inside. 11.2 million pounds of potato chips. So if you can just imagine, this is not a very heavy bag, potato chips, 11.2 million pounds of these. It gets even worse. You got about 14 billion burgers that are consumed. And then the day after, about 1.5 million Americans call off sick, and antacid medicine rises 30% the week after the Super Bowl, right? We are a nation, and we are a people, not just humans, but I think in our Western culture, that consumes all the time. Now, I'm not against food. I love food. I love consuming food. I love everything about food, right? But it's interesting how much consumption we have as people and how it's everywhere, right? 50,000 different locations of fast food restaurants. You have McDonald's everywhere. It is in our face all the time. You got to consume this new burger. You have to consume this new meal. It is all over the place. And I think that because we are in a consumeristic nation, I think because our consumption is so high, it creates assumptions about fasting when we hear that word. We joke about it, right? I joke about it with you. I'm like, wow, Josiah got the easy one because feasting just makes sense to us. But fasting, we don't know where to start or where to go. But I think our culture, in light of this consumption, is trying to make answers, and they're trying to bring fasting back into the light. So I would call it this, the diet answer. The diet answer is how we see fasting. I don't know how many of you have seen or heard of diets like intermittent fasting, right? It's not a bad thing. I think it's a really positive thing. But we kind of run into this consumption problem, and what we do is we inject kind of how do we get better physically, and that's how we see fasting. It's just this diet answer to our physical needs and our wants and things of that nature. And I'm not saying that using fasting as a diet program is bad. It has a lot of physical benefits. But as you flesh it out, there are so many different ways that you can practice it as a diet. The first way is this, the 16-8 method. This means that you fast 16 hours a day, and then you have an 8-hour block where you can eat those meals and have those snacks, and that's when you eat. Another one is the 5-2 diet. You fast for 2 days per week. I don't know if you get to pick or if there's a certain kind of regulation, but you have 2 days where you fast. The eat, stop, eat. So you go 24-hour fast once or twice a week. The alternate day fasting, you fast every other day. Right? The warrior diet. This one just sounds awesome, right? Fasting during the day and then you eat a huge meal at night. Okay? That's like you fast all day and then you get to dinner and you're like, it is on, right? You get all the pizzas, all that good stuff. And the last one is my favorite, spontaneous meal skipping. You skip meals when it's convenient to you. I like that, right? You just get to skip it when you feel like you want to fast and you feel good about fasting, and then you get to eat the rest of the time. But I think it's interesting because our culture, I think at some level does recognize the consumption problem we have, in particular to food. But what we do is we run into fasting and we see it as a diet plan. We see it as something we can do to maintain our physical physique. It's something that athletes do. It's something that just hardcore trainers promote. It's something that we run into in that way. I think we have a total misunderstanding of fasting as a practice. I think we do, and I think it comes off of the consumption problem, and then I think it's like, well, this is the answer of dieting, right? That's how it works. That's what fasting is, and it is nothing against any of us. I think it's just how our nation is and our culture is right now. But what is biblical fasting? We got to start there. What in the world is biblical fasting? I would say this. It's abstaining from food for spiritual purposes. It's abstaining from food for spiritual purposes. And we'll talk about other things that you can abstain from for spiritual purposes that also work into fasting. But when you look biblically at the stories and at people that fasted, it mainly was for spiritual purposes, and it had to deal with food. So let's just roll through it, because Josiah took you to the Old Testament. He took you to some stories about feasting. There's some profound stories about fasting also that we're going to look at in the first part of the Bible. Leviticus 16:29 starts like this. Note to self, don't start in Leviticus. If you're starting to read the Bible and you're new, don't start in Leviticus, okay? It's a hard book. This is to be a lasting ordinance for you. This is kind of God speaking into his people. On the 10th day of the 7th month, you must deny yourselves and not do any work. That deny yourselves, if you kind of translate that out and see what they're meaning, it means to fast. Okay, so it's like on the 10th day of the 7th month, fast and do not do any work. Don't do any work. Sabbath. So the people of Israel had one day in particular of the year that it was commanded to them to fast. That was the Day of Atonement. That's what's being referenced in here. So when we look back at the Israelites and the laws and the commands that God played out for them, this was just the one day that they fasted. Okay, it's fascinating to me. There's just one day. They make this prolonged thing. He didn't really flesh out what that looks like completely. And then we go on and we see in Exodus 34. Exodus 34:28, we come to this guy named Moses. He split the Red Sea, led the Israelites out of Egypt. And we see this written out. Moses was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights without eating bread or drinking water. Okay, I don't know if that shocks you or not, but to imagine going 40 days and 40 nights without food or water is insane. Okay, and we'll get to this point. Don't start fasting in that rhythm. Okay, you'll end up in the hospital. It's not a positive thing. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments. I would have you write this down. Fasting goes along with being in the presence of God. This is not on the slides, and I'm sorry about that, but fasting goes along with being in the presence of God. Moses is literally fasting as he's sitting there with the Lord. And he is writing out the 10 commandments. He's writing out what God is commanding him to write. It's interesting to me. Next section I would take you to is Nehemiah 1:4. Nehemiah 1:4 says this, "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." Give you some background. Nehemiah, he is a part of seeing the Israelites. They were in exile, going back to their city of Jerusalem and just seeing it torn to pieces. It is not how they left it, right? The temple's just torn to pieces. It is a sad reality of what was. And he's saying, I am sitting this and I'm mourning for you. I'm weeping for you. I'm running to fasting. I'm running into God because this is just overwhelming. I would say fasting goes along with compassion deeply. That Nehemiah had this compassion for the people of Israel. And we even see this, that Nehemiah goes on and he fasts again in Nehemiah 9. We see that he not only fasts, but in that moment of fasting, he has confession that is linked to it. It's fascinating how fasting kind of plays out in some Old Testament characters in people's lives. We go on, if you look at Daniel in the lion's den, right? Daniel had 3 buddies, and they were thrown into the fire, and they were saved from there. But we see this later on in his story. So I turned to the Lord God and pleaded with him in prayer and petition, in fasting and in sackcloth and ashes. He is pleading and petitioning for the people of God. They're in exile. They're not where they're supposed to be. And they recognizes this, and he's like, I'm just crying out to you, God. He's mourning and has this compassion in prayer, and he runs to God in fasting in the midst of this. If you keep going in Psalm 35:13, we see a guy by the name of David. He writes a lot of the Psalms. He was a king, right? King David, and he writes many of the Psalms, and a lot of these Psalms are just his heart, and he is speaking and talking to God and hearing from God. And in this Psalm in particular, he is writing about his enemies. This is not like a fairy tale psalm where everything's going well. He's like crying out, and he's like, if I could, I would get rid of my enemies like that. I want them gone. Yet, he says this, when they were ill, his enemies is who he's referring to, I put on sackcloth and humbled myself with fasting. See, that fasting relates to humility, and we're going to look at that even in the midst of pain, even in the midst of sorrow, even in the midst of enemies attacking David, he's like, I'm going to come to you, Lord, in fasting for my enemies. I'm going to humble myself, even though I want to do all these things to get back at them. I want to humble myself in front of you. If you continue, Esther 4:16 says this. Esther, she is a queen. She marries this king, and he is going after the people of God, basically. He says, I'm gonna get rid of them, right? Some different events take place, and she's like, no, those are my people. And so she sends this out, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my attendants will fast as you do. It's interesting, that is the first response for her. Before she enters into the king's throne room, before she enters into the conversation with the king, she says, I want all the people of God to fast, and I'm going to fast with my attendants. I think fasting has a deep part connected to faith. That she's like, I need to run to my God, and I need to give this to him before I make any steps myself. That this is not on me, this is on my God and who he is and what he's about, that I can trust in him even in the midst of awfulness happening. Fasting not only is seen in the Old Testament, that's the first section of the Bible, but you also see this in the New Testament. Luke 2:47 says this, or 37, sorry. It's talking about a lady named Anna, and this is what she did. She never left the temple, but worshiped night and day, fasting and praying. That was her life. She was a widow, and she spent her time fasting and praying and worshiping to God. We also see this as the early church started in Acts 13. We see that their response is to fast. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." We see fasting is related to worshiping, but I also think fasting is related to decisions, and we see sending in the early church. I think that they ran to God in realization that this is not on their own. They can't do it on their own, that they have to run to the one they trust in for decisions they need to make, and fasting was a response of that. As I read throughout this, and I read the different biblical passages about fasting, what stands out to me is the interaction it has with prayer and meditation and mourning and grief, right? There's an urgency for people to run to fasting in moments of trouble or sadness, or these moments that are overwhelming, or these moments that have big decisions connected to them. That's when you see people running to fasting, that they're just in awe. They're like, I need to run to God in this. It's also interesting to me that God doesn't necessarily command fasting to happen multiple times in the Bible. There's only one time we see that in Leviticus, the Day of Atonement. Just kind of laid out there, I want you to fast the people of God, and he kind of leaves it at that. There's not many logistics to fasting as you read through the Bible. It's not like there's a whole chapter that lays out, this is how you practice it, this is where it goes, this is what you need to do, this is how it needs to play out. But I think what's interesting as you continue to read, we see what Jesus says about fasting, and that will give us some pieces on how we play this out in our lives. So this is where we're going to go, Jesus and fasting, and then we're going to look at the implications it has for our lives. And then we're going to just talk real about the logistics of fasting, because it can be confusing, and it can be like, do you mean like going a week without food? What does this mean for me? So let's look at Jesus and fasting. We're going to start in Matthew 4. We're going to start in Matthew 4. We've been in this passage quite a bit the last few months, but it just kind of keeps ringing around. Here's what you need to know. I just ran through all those biblical passages. They have meaning. They have deep, deep context to them that are read in them, and Matthew has context to what he is writing into, the culture and the people. Matthew is writing the story of Jesus. He's writing the stories of Jesus, the life of Jesus. In particular, this is key, he's writing to a Jewish audience. It's not just writing to anybody and everybody. He is specifically writing to a Jewish audience. He's writing and he's referring to a lot of Old Testament stories and a lot of Old Testament characters. He's writing into the culture of the Jewish nation, which sticks out because the Jewish nation would have practiced fasting. And so they would have found these conversations to be quite intriguing as Matthew writes out what Jesus has to say about fasting. Let's start in Matthew 4, 1 through 2. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Let me give you some context, okay? In the chapter before, we see Jesus is being baptized by John the Baptist. We see this neat picture of Jesus, the Son, the Father, God, and the Holy Spirit all in the same picture, and they send Jesus out. The Holy Spirit leads Jesus into this wilderness. Right? And for some, it means, or we can conclude that it means kind of a desert or this area where Jesus is alone. We talked about this Solitude Week, where he is alone, he's spending time alone, and it says that he's going to be tempted by Satan, by the devil. And then we continue, verse 2, after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. Shocking, right? 40 days and 40 nights of no food. We see before Jesus even starts his ministry, that's where he runs, is a moment of solitude and fasting in the wilderness. That before his ministry, before he gets his disciples together, before he goes out and he teaches, before anything starts, he runs into fasting. And it's interesting, he fasts even before Satan tempts him. I think it just correlates perfectly, right? Jesus runs into fasting. Jesus fasted. You need to note that first. That's what we're going to flesh out first. Jesus fasted, right? He practiced this. He put this into play in his life. This was a rhythm of his life. We see this pictured in this chapter. If you continue in Matthew 9, we also see another story where Jesus kind of interacts with this understanding of fasting. What you need to know about Matthew 9, right before this passage that we're going to look at happens, Jesus calls Matthew, who is the writer of this book, Matthew in the Bible, he calls him and says, come follow me, be a disciple of me, be a student under me. I want you to follow me. And Matthew says, yep, I'm going to do that. Matthew was a tax collector, and before they get on to ministry stuff, Matthew's like, I want to invite you over to my home. Come over to my house. Let's go hang out. I'm going to invite my tax collector friends, my sinners. You invite your disciples, the rest of them. You come over. Let's have a feast. Let's enjoy food together. Let's enjoy hanging out. Right? Jesus liked to hang out. He liked to eat with others. He liked to be around people. And so Jesus runs into this scene, and they're having this feast, abundant feast that they get to enjoy together. And then we see this take place, Matthew 9:14. Then John's disciples came and asked him. Who's John's disciples? It's John the Baptist. John the Baptist had disciples. They came and asked Jesus, how is it that we and the Pharisees fast often? Okay, just a little note, context, a little what their culture was. They found that fasting was played out 2 separate days of the week. That's what they concluded, John's disciples and the Pharisees. They said Monday and Thursday are fasting days. That's when they fasted. So they come to Jesus. He's coming off of this feast. He's coming off eating all this food. And they're like, so we fast often, but your disciples do not fast. Has anybody in the room ever been around someone that just sucks the air out of a room? You're like, wow, that's really fun, right? That's what they're doing. They come in, everybody's having a good time, feasting, enjoying the party. Matthew's hosting. And all of a sudden, John's disciples and the Pharisees are like, so why aren't you fasting, Jesus, right? It's interesting. If you continue, in Matthew 9:15, goes on, Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, then they will fast. So Jesus responds, right? He responds with an illustration. He responds by saying, the bridegroom is here. I don't know how many of you have been at a wedding before. I would imagine all of us have been to a wedding, been in a wedding. Last night, I officiated my first wedding, and so it was really exciting and fun to be with the couple there. And as I was officiating, we got through the ceremony, right? If you've ever been to a wedding, there's a party that happens afterwards. So me and my wife got to stay for the party afterwards because there was food there, right? You got to enjoy all the food. And so we sat down, and there's just food on top of food on top of food. If you've ever been to a wedding, you know that it is a party. It is a celebration for the bride and the groom. It's a celebration for the family. In the Jewish culture, our weddings look pitiful compared to what they did. They would spend weeks partying. They would spend a week celebrating. They would have food on top of food on top of food. The ceremony might happen on Saturday, but not until the next Saturday that they stopped celebrating that feast, right? They had a plethora of people around. And it's funny that Jesus uses this as an illustration. He says, no, the bridegroom is here. We're celebrating. We're feasting in my presence. I'm present with my disciples. Why would we fast? This is supposed to be joyous. I want to enjoy this time with them. We're supposed to enjoy this around food. He says, but there is a time that will come when I will go back up to my Father, and that is when they will fast. And this is what I'd have you write down. Jesus points to his disciples fasting. Jesus points to his disciples fasting. He says, in that moment, when my presence is not on this earth anymore, when I'm not physically here and I go up to the Father, they will fast. They will fast to run into my presence. They will fast to be with me. Right? It's interesting, right, that he uses that illustration, and yet he doesn't give logistics. Like, he doesn't really give, like, this is how they're going to fast, or you got to fast. He just kind of comes to an assumption that they will fast out of the response of my presence not being here. But Jesus, earlier in Matthew, gives us kind of how the practice gets laid out. Matthew 6, and then we'll hit some points, and then we'll go from there. When you fast, this is Jesus talking, okay? It's Jesus talking. When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do. He's talking about the Pharisees, the religious leaders. For they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. We see, but when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. It's interesting. Jesus, he talks about fasting. He's like, this is how you should fast. And I'm kind of a checklist, logistical guy, and I'm like, okay, that's really neat, but how do I do it? What in the world are you talking about, Jesus? Like, I know, don't do it like the hypocrites, but how do I do this? And I think Jesus is getting at something. And it's something that we need to see before we get into how does this play out? How does this get practiced? I write this down. Jesus points to the heart of fasting. Jesus points to the heart of fasting. If you look at what he's talking about here, he's referencing the Pharisees, the religious leaders, and they practiced fasting twice a week, Monday and Thursday. They had a rhythm, but when they did it, they would walk out into the town center, and their faces would kind of look downcast, right? They would put on a show of, I'm fasting. I'm in this moment of fasting. Like, you need to know that. I'm super religious. I got everything figured out. We're doing it on Monday. We're doing it on Thursday. Just like, no, they're hypocrites. That's not what fasting is about. That's not even close to the heart of fasting. It's not for human approval. It's not for public spectacle. That's not what this is about. It's rather be done in private between you and the Father. That is the heart of fasting. I think it's interesting that Jesus talks about the private interaction that you have with the Father in this moment of fasting, and he doesn't mention anything about how, when, what, where, why. He does mention why, but how, what, when, where. He doesn't mention that stuff because I think he is more invested into the heart of fasting than he is into the logistics of fasting. And there's logistics to it, but I think he wants us to grapple with the heart of fasting before we even get into where does it look to run into fasting. So, what is the heart of fasting? We'll run through this, okay? We'll run through this. What is the heart of fasting? The first thing is this. The heart of fasting is God-centered. The heart of fasting is God-centered. I think that in comparison, or maybe not comparison, but in contrast, I should say, the heart of fasting, there's a heart of consumption. The heart of fasting is God-centered. The heart of consumption would be me-centered. The heart of consumption is me-centered. In our culture, we're always over here, and it's about me filling my needs. It's about me filling my wants. It's about me filling my desires. If I get what I want and how I want it and when I want it, then I will be okay. It becomes about me, right? We see this in our culture with filling us up, but I also think that we see this with the Pharisees, that they honestly had a heart of consumption, a consumption of, they needed approval from people. They needed people to see how religious they were. They needed to see the public spectacle. They needed to fill something that was missing. And the heart of fasting and why we practice fasting is completely about being God-centered. That we run into this relationship with our Father in heaven. And I think Jesus points this out. I think he points this out because I think we can get distracted by the practice of fasting before we see the heart of fasting. That we can get distracted by making sure the logistics of fasting are all in line and people see that I'm doing the right things before we see the heart of fasting, and it is completely around God. It's interesting in Luke 2:37, we're going back to this passage. Anna, she never left the temple but worshiped night and day, fasting and praying. And then Acts 13:2 says, while they were worshiping the Lord and fasting. You see this in the New Testament. There is a fixation on God when they are fasting. This is not just for physical benefits. This is not just to look good religiously. This is purely to run into the presence of God and be there and worship who he is. I'm going to fast and make it a God-centric thing. That's where it's at. I could end there, right? Could end there because that's what it should be about. And Jesus is calling out the Pharisees and the hypocrites and saying, no, you got it all wrong. Your heart is in the wrong place. Fasting now has become just something you do. It's something that's just added on. It's just that Christian duty. It's whatever. It's become about you and fixating something that's missing in you and fixating maybe the appetites that you have. It's fixated on you, and it should be fixated on me. The heart of fasting is God-centered, but I also think the heart of fasting brings humility. The heart of fasting brings humility. I think the heart of consumption brings control. I think the heart of consumption brings control, not only the things that I can control, but the things that have control on our lives. That oftentimes as we consume and the consumeristic mentality is filling up what has control in our lives, the appetites, the desires, the wills. Well, I got to fill myself up, and if I can control my life and figure it out, then I've got it all figured. I can buy this and do this and eat this, and I got control. Because I can consume whatever I want, whenever I want, however I want. I got control of my life. And I think that God, as he leans into this understanding of fasting, he's like, no. I want you to come to a point of humility. I want fasting to be this practice of humility, to run into me, to know who guides and directs and steers and brings truth to your life. That's me. That's why you practice fasting. It's interesting. Galatians 5:16-17 says this. This is Paul talking. He says, so I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. Right? We want to have control. We want to have all these things, and we gratify the desires of our flesh. And what happens is the flesh starts to control us, and we're just filling, and we're filling, and we're filling. Right? What our appetites are, what our addictions are, what we want, so that we can have control of our lives, and we can fill it up how we think is best to fill it up, and yet it leaves us empty. And he goes on, for the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. I think that fasting breaks me away from the things that have control in my life. It breaks me away from the things that I want to have control in my life and allows me to humble myself before God to see what does control me, and then ultimately hand that to God and say, no, Lord, this is yours. And my life is yours, my appetites, my desires, my wants. I need to humble myself because I so often want to control my life, and so often I run into things that eventually will control me. Psalm 35:13, this is David. We're just going back to passages that we've already stated. Yet when they were ill, I put on a sackcloth and humbled myself with fasting. Listen, fasting, very, very, very opposite to the hypocrites of, look at me, how's this, look at what I'm doing, the religious beliefs. It should be something that's just humbling. That I'm going to humble myself personally by fasting to run into God. And I think what happens then is humility fixates my heart on God and others. C.S. Lewis says this, okay, tie this in with a bow. The essence of gospel humility is not thinking more of myself or thinking less of myself. It is thinking of myself less. Gospel humility is not needing to think about myself. I think that humility, running into fasting, brings humility, and it allows you to center everything on God. And we're going to talk about this, be present to others and their needs. That is gospel humility. It's not thinking less of myself, more of myself. It is thinking of myself less. Lastly, I would say this. The heart of fasting brings trust. The heart of fasting brings trust. Trust in God and who he is and what he's done. The heart of consumption brings worry. The heart of consumption brings worry. That is the consumption culture. That's what we see on ads all the time. You're missing out with this. You should get into this. You should do this. Don't forget this, right? If you see all the new ads for food, it's like, try this, try that. You don't want to miss out. And so we start to worry, are we keeping up? Are we doing enough? Are we going to miss out on this thing? Or am I going to lose this thing? And I'm worried about always making sure I'm settled and I'm okay and my life is figured out, right? What happens is, I think consumption actually brings more worry, because am I actually keeping up with what I need to keep up with? Am I actually filling the desires and the needs and the appetites that I have? Am I doing that well enough? Am I sitting well enough in that? And the heart of fasting is all about trusting that God provides and cares and gives. John 4, we're going to just read this real quick. The context of John 4 is this. Jesus and his disciples, they run into a Samaritan woman. The disciples, they go into town, they get some food, and Jesus is there with this Samaritan woman, and he's talking to her, which would have been shocking because Israelites and Samaritans, Jewish people and Samaritans didn't talk. They were like enemies, basically. And it would have been even more fascinating because men and women in that culture didn't communicate directly to each other very much at all. And so this was an interesting interaction. And the disciples, they come back and they see Jesus interacting with this woman. And they come back with some food and they're like, hey, Jesus, we got food for you. And this is what they say. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you know nothing about. Then his disciples said to each other, could someone have brought him food? Right? Could someone else kind of stole that? My food, said Jesus, is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. That our food in fasting, our food is actually feasting on God's word. That when you fast from food, when you fast in life, that ultimately it should push you to feast on who God is and what he is about through his word. That we see the heart of fasting points me to the feasting on God's word and prayer. That's where it should be, right? That's where it should be. That when you fast, it's not just like, oh, I'm doing it for physical, or, oh, I guess I got to fast today, but rather in moments of fasting, maybe when you are skipping that meal, that you're running to God's word and you're feasting on his truth and who he is, and you're learning how to trust in his will from his word. That's where it is at. So, what are the fasting implications for me? Okay? What are the fasting implications for me? Where do we go from here? Because I think that we live in a consumer-driven culture. I've said this. Consumer-driven culture, a pleasure-driven culture that is always trying to find what fills my needs and my desires and my wants, my longings, right? And I think that this culture pushes those things because each and every one of us, listen up, each and every one of us longs for something. Like, this is not a response. This consumeristic driven culture didn't just happen to happen. It is actually trying to fill a need and a longing that each and every one of us have. And I think inside of us, we're all wrestling with, how do we seek happiness? How do we fill ourselves? How do we fill the emptiness that we have? How do we seek joy and peace in our life? And this consumeristic culture is just pushing all these things to us and saying, if you get into this, and if you enjoy this, and if you eat all this, and you make sure you get the donuts of life, and you get all that is, then you will fill those emptiness inside of you. And it is a lie. It is a lie. And for some of us in this room, you're just exploring this Jesus thing, Christianity, God thing. And for you this morning, maybe it's not the fasting implications right away that pop out to you, but maybe you are filling and trying to fill your life with these things that you think will fill the appetites of your life. Maybe it's food. Like, what if I just have the right things? Maybe it's your body and you're trying to fill this appetite of looking the right way. Maybe for some of you it's work. Maybe for some of you it's family stuff. Maybe for some of you it's shopping, it's clothes. Maybe for some of you it's relationships. Maybe for some of you it's sex. Maybe for some of you it's entertainment. You're trying to fill up this emptiness, this void that's in your life, the appetite that you have, and it's driving you to these things, more of these things that will never ultimately fill you, and that will be gone, and you'll be empty again. And Jesus says, no, for you, I want you to run to me, because I'm the only one that can fill you. I'm the only one that can bring you life. I'm the only one that can fill the emptiness of your life and of your soul. And he says, I came to this earth as a man to go to the cross, to die for each and every one of you. So that if you say yes to me, you will have life and life to its fullest. John 10:10 says this. Jesus says, I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. He says, me coming to the cross, dying for each and every one of your sins, and rising again, if you believe in me, you spend eternity with me. So we get to feast in heaven and party in his presence. Like, that's amazing. But he also says this, I give you meaning and purpose on this earth, that you don't need to be driven to the things that this world is going to promise you, and the things of this world that are going to promote to you, the things of the world that they're going to fill up their emptiness, and then all of a sudden it's gone. He says, no, I fill completely, and I give you life so that you can live this life with meaning and purpose and have eternity with me. But that's for some of us. For some of us, maybe never said yes to Jesus. For others of us, we've said yes to Jesus, and yet this table just keeps drawing us closer. It just keeps drawing us closer, and we're like, I don't know, I'm just trying to kind of fill, and I'm not sure where to trust. I'm not sure. I'm worried about life. I have this control stuff. I'm not sure where to go. And I'm just keep getting pulled to what the consumeristic thought is of the day. And for you, I would say there's two things. First is this, fasting, and why I would challenge you to fast. It fixates on God. We talked about that. But Zechariah 7:4-6 says this, then the word of the Lord Almighty came to me, ask all the people of the land and the priests when you fasted and mourned in the 5th and 7th month for the past 70 years, was it really for me that you fasted And when you were eating and drinking, were you not just feasting for yourselves? Listen, if we're going to practice fasting, it is not about me, but we have to enter into the mindset that it is centered on God. Fasting allows us to humble ourselves before Him by prayer and confession. Fasting allows us to trust in God through His word and His character. That's why we practice fasting. When you look at Matthew 9, Jesus says, I just assume my disciples are going to fast. I just assume because I want them to be my presence. I want them to be with me. I want them to run into me and trust me and humble themselves before me and have that relationship with me. But it also does something else. Fasting focuses on others. Fasting focuses on others. Right? It's interesting, right? It's interesting, that statement, because you're like, isn't this between me and God? I'm not supposed to tell anybody that I'm fasting. I'm not supposed to do that, right? We just talked about that, the public spectacle. Isaiah 58 says this, is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry, to provide the poor wander with shelter, when you see the naked to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? I think oftentimes that we see fasting as just this thing that kind of happens and we practice this, but I also think it creates a deep desire to help those around us and those who are in need. It allows us to hone in on that need and see where God directs us in pointing to helping them. Fasting allows us to run into the needs of others. It curbs our appetites so that we can be attentive to others. It curbs our appetites and what we think we want and we desire and what I got to fill up my emptiness, and it allows us to focus on the needs of others. I thought it was fascinating, especially in light of this past couple weeks, as I interact with people and stuff. Like, how can we help best? How can we help best? Because I think we are bent to help others. How can I help the needs of others, especially in times of sorrow and pain and grief and mourning? This is what I would say. You might disagree with me, but I think one of the first responses can be fasting and prayer. That you run into God, and like fasting is connected to compassion and mourning and grief. And you run to God in prayer as you lay out curbing your appetites so that you can just totally separate yourself from there and realize the needs of others. And say, how can I flesh this out in my life, and how can I help others in this? It allows you to respond in that way. So, how do I start fasting? How should I start fasting? Okay, 4 things, and I'll let you go. Okay, it's been 3 weeks, so I gotta get everything out, right? How should I start fasting? First, fast slow. See what we did there? Fast slow. Do not start with 40 days and 40 nights. Okay, I'll be visiting you all in the hospital. I don't want to do that. Okay, start with a 24-hour period. Start with a lunch period that you go to work, maybe you fast, and that's where you set in practice that. Start with a day, right? Whatever it may be, but fast slow. Don't make it something that you have to achieve all these things, and I have to be like Moses, 40 days and 40 nights, and like, no. Don't start there. Start with some day that you can lock in and say, this is when I want to start practicing this. The second thing I would say is be smart, okay? Be smart. Okay, maybe you have medical needs, medical complications, diabetes, whatever it may be. Ask your doctor what is smart to do fasting-wise. You might be pregnant, right? Be smart in how you are fasting. Okay, it doesn't have to look one way. It doesn't have to play out in like a week-long thing. That may not be smart for you. But there are ways that you can kind of finagle your fasting so that it is played out in practice and how it is smart for you. Thirdly, be quiet. Be quiet, right? Just like Jesus said, do not make this a public spectacle. This is not about rah, Joel is fasting, we're doing all this religious things. It's private interaction between you and God. Now, you may need to let your spouse know because you're not eating their dinner or something, and they're like, why aren't you eating dinner tonight, right? I understand that, but don't make it this thing that like, oh, I'm so fasting today, I'm so hungry, all that stuff. And the last thing I would say this. Say be creative. Be creative. We didn't talk a lot about these things, but primarily fasting in the Bible is associated with food. But I'd say across the board, there are multiple different things that you can fast from. For some of us, it may not be food. It may be our cell phones. That you take a day and you turn it off and you just put it in the next room and you fast from it. Maybe it's your computer, right? You put your computer away and you fast from your computer and being on that. Maybe it's sex for some of you. in a marriage relationship. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul lays that out. Right? And he says maybe that's the way. Maybe it's entertainment where you and your family just don't watch any TV or go out to a movie for a whole day, right? But maybe for you it's food. And here's where I want to end. That before you run into the practice of fasting, that you align your heart with God's heart in the heart of fasting. And it will allow you to enter into this practice with a whole new mindset. Let's pray.